But I think I have learned something. I have learned that whilst in my younger days I thoroughly enjoyed debating and arguing, I have concluded with this accumulated wisdom now that arguing usually is counterproductive. Not only does it not produce what you hope to produce, it often produces the opposite of what you hope to produce, counterproductive. And so I've given a lot of thought to this. For instance, if you have an argument, you can win it or lose it. You see, if you win the argument, what happens? Well, the person who you've beaten in the argument is humiliated. They feel stupid. They may even feel intimidated, but one thing is certain, they'll keep out of your way. So you've won an argument and lost the relationship. Counterproductive. On the other hand, you may lose the argument, in which case the person who beat you in the argument is going to say, what a dummy he is. Why in the world did I waste all that time talking to him? He is as thick as two short planks. What is the good of talking to a person like that? I'm not going to waste any more time, and so he disappears too. What's happened? You've lost an argument and you've lost a relationship as well. So here's what I have concluded. I'm going to try to do something infinitely harder than having an argument. And that is trying to find points of agreement. Trying to find points of agreement. Now, Jill and I have the privilege of traveling all over the world. We've been on every continent. And on every continent, with the exception of Antarctica, we've been there too. But as far as evangelism is concerned, very, very disappointing indeed. Penguins are, I think they're atheists. Anyway, there was no warmth there towards the message at all. On every continent, we have found a point of agreement, and I'm sure you're all on the front edge of your seats now in anticipation. Oh, I'd love to know what that is. Well, if you're really very good and quiet, I will tell you at the end of this talk. No, I'll tell you now. The point of agreement that I have concluded is this. Things are not the way they ought to be. Now, just introduce that into a boring conversation sometime. And I promise you, it won't be boring for long. There will be no disagreement. You will very, very quickly find not only that people will nod their heads wisely and say, that's right, things are not the way they ought to be. They will then give you illustrations from their personal experience, to which you will respond by giving more illustrations from your personal experience. And in the end, there will be a resounding agreement, something very, very unusual in this fractured world of ours, a point of general agreement. But then the question is, now where do we go? So we're all agreed here. Things are not the way they ought to be. Well, this is where you can go. You can say, I was just thinking, if things are not the way they ought to be, does that not presuppose there is a way things ought to be? And then say, never thought about that. And if we agree that assuming that there is a way things ought to be precedes concluding things are not the way they ought to be, then the obvious question that's going to come up then is, how did we get from the way things ought to be to the way things are now? How do we get here? Before long, you begin to discover that some people that you were talking to are actually doing theology. They would be horrified if they realized that's what it is. But when we start to think in terms of the way things are and the way things ought to be, we're thinking about origins. And we've only got two options. The two options are either, I believe that God is and that he created the heavens and the earth, or I believe that God isn't and he didn't create the heavens and the earth. That's where you start. One of the two options. Everybody you'll meet started somewhere with one of those two faith presuppositions. I believe that God is and that he created the heavens and the earth, or I believe that God isn't and he didn't create the heavens and the earth. Somehow or other it got here. No idea how. All right. Now, if I look at the situation and we're agreed things are not the way they ought to be, and I say to myself that assumes there is a way things ought to be, and a good way of looking at the way things ought to be is, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, had a look at what he made, pronounced it good, and guess what? Things were the way they ought to be. Now look at this. Not only do we conclude things are not the way they ought to be, if we're honest, we'll say nothing is the way it ought to be. Everything seems to have a twist, a feint. Everything seems to have a warp to it. Nothing is actually the way it appears to be. We hear something that sounds really great and immediately say, what's the catch? We know nothing is the way it ought to be, which now it gets personal. If nothing is the way it ought to be, that means I, as part of the created order, am not the way I ought to be. And forgive me, neither are you. And if that is true, nothing about me is the way it ought to be. My body isn't the way it ought to be. That's why we have doctors. My mind isn't the way it ought to be because, quite frankly, I get hold of the wrong end of the stick quite frequently. And what I don't know would fill a library. Actually, my emotions are not the way they ought to be because they get bent out of shape far too quickly. My will is not the way it ought to be because, frankly, I make some bad decisions. So do you. Nothing is the way it ought to be.